Nobody owns you, and nobody owns me.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hey everybody, in this episode, I'd like to address the concept of self-ownership. It's a common discussion amongst libertarians and tends to make Christians a little squeamish and a little unsure how to address this concept that seems to be foundational to liberty and our understanding of statelessness. Well, I hope to thoroughly address that today and help you feel a little bit more comfortable with this concept. So before we get into answering the objection or addressing that uncomfortable feeling we have when we hear the term self-ownership, let's look into exactly where this term comes from and what it means. When you look into the philosophy of self-ownership, you run into a couple of synonymous terms, and that is self-sovereignty and sovereignty of the individual. Okay, I can hear you squirming a little. I know the term sovereignty in our circles is generally reserved for God. And you're thinking, yeah, you're not helping your case. You're making it worse. But just hang in there with me, okay? When we dig into commentaries on this concept, we quickly get into economic arguments. Because if you own yourself, you own the product of your labor. And it is interesting that competing sides, namely the socialist and the libertarian anarchist, can find some small area of agreement, yet still come to a vastly different conclusion. Anarcho-communist professor L. Susan Brown puts it this way: liberalism and anarchism are two political philosophies that are fundamentally concerned with individual freedom, yet differ from one another in very distinct ways. Anarchism shares with liberalism a commitment to individual freedom while rejecting liberalism's competitive property relations. So obviously there's a lot to define here. And when you understand how she's using these terms, it becomes a little bit more clear. She's using anarchism in this communist, socialist sort of way, and liberalism in this classical liberal, libertarian sense. Communism not accepting the idea of property rights, and liberalism being based completely in its understanding of property rights and private property. It's unfortunate that there isn't a hard and fast definition of self-ownership, but there are plenty of commentaries that will, I think, paint a full picture for you to understand. So let's go over a few. First, as with most libertarian or classically liberal concepts, we can look to John Locke, as he seemed to originally formulate so much of what we understand of liberty and property. He wrote in his 1689 book, Two Treatises on Government, that, quote, every man has a property in his own person. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy attributes the philosophy of self-ownership mostly to Robert Nozick. And how they sum up his position is this. Quote, the key libertarian starting point is that people have a very stringent, perhaps the most stringent possible, set of rights over their persons, giving them the kind of control over themselves that one might have over possessions they own. This includes 1. Rights to control the use of the entity, including a liberty right to use it as well as a claim right that others not use it without one's consent. 2. rights to transfer these rights to others by sale, rental, gift, or loan. 3. Immunities to the non-consensual loss of these rights. 4. Compensation rights in case others use the entity without one's consent. And 5. Enforcement rights. Rights to restrain persons about to violate these rights. One of my favorite thinkers is Murray Rothbard. He thoroughly thought through so many of these economic and social concepts that he's a great source when trying to get a grasp of any of them. Rothbard says, if a man has the right to self-ownership to the control of his life, then in the real world he must also have the right to sustain his life. And here, Rothbard really drives home our distaste for the state within this topic of self-ownership with this. The essential activities of the state necessarily constitute criminal aggression and depredation of the just rights of private property of its subjects, including self-ownership. As well as self-ownership giving you the ownership of the product of your labor, it also gives you the authority over your own body. And that goes for physical harm or kidnapping. I found this quote while I was doing a little research on all this, and I really like how it gets to the point in the legal sense. Daniel Alexander Brackins says in his book, Private Property, Law, and the State, to make a claim of ownership implies a claim against others. That is, others must refrain from interfering with your use of that thing. As such, the very act of the body occupying its standing room is to make a claim against others because only one body can occupy the space at a time. So, to look at it another way, if we think someone cannot harm us or kidnap us, we are acknowledging self-ownership. And if we'd like to step back and look at someone else, consider our neighbors or loved ones, if someone can't harm or kidnap them, you are acknowledging that they have ownership of themselves.
There's a Bible verse I think about sometimes.
Okay. I think that's thoroughly understood. You may have to think on it a little bit more, listen to those quotes a few more times. But if you've got it, let's jump right into the biblical objection you might hear, and that is, everything belongs to God. This is coming from a number of biblical passages that would be way too lengthy to completely list. But let's look at a few of them. Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. Deuteronomy 10:14. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. And I think it's fair to even look at some of the analogies in the New Testament. A common phrase is that we were bought by Jesus' blood. We see this play out in a few places with terms like redeemed and ransomed. Terms that express this exchange and imply a purchasing by God and therefore an ownership as well. Just a few of them are Galatians 3:13 and 14. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. That's God's law, by the way, not Roman. But Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree, so that in Christ, Jesus, the blessing of Abraham, might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. And one verse further, number 15, we see terms that further relate to this transactional understanding. To give a human example, brothers, even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. And one more from the New Testament that I'd like to show is 1 Peter 1:18 and 19. Knowing that you are ransomed, there's this purchasing talk again. Ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. So again, purchased, not with gold or money, but with Christ's death on the cross. I could stay here much longer because this is the gospel, and it brings me so much joy. But I know we need to keep moving with our topic of self-ownership. So yeah, on its surface, it sounds like maybe we are usurping God's ownership of ourselves when we declare that we have self-ownership. We've seen the verses, we've seen the secular commentaries on self-ownership. So how do we affirm both? You might remember a concept I brought up a little while back when trying to explain how anarchism is compatible with Christianity. And that is the idea of the horizontal and the vertical relationships. The vertical relationship is our relationship with God, who is above us and greater than us. This is where the verses that I just went over fall into context. The horizontal relationship is how we understand our relationship between each other, between family, friends, neighbors, strangers, you name it, anyone else, any other person or people. This is the horizontal relationship. And this is right where anarchism and self-ownership fall into context. This is the way we speak politically. We are speaking in horizontal terms. So, it begs the question, if we have an issue with self-ownership because God owns everything, are we also out of turn when we say that we own anything? Is a rancher violating Psalm 50 when God says he owns all the cattle and all the hills, when the rancher says that he owns his cattle and land that they're grazing on? No. Why? Because we understand the horizontal relationship here. The rancher is showing his ownership of those things between other people. This is why it's so important to understand the horizontal relationship. To understand that we can own things. It's in the 10 Commandments. Do not steal. Well, you can't steal anything if no one owns anything. And while we're on the topic of self-ownership and theft, I think we have another verse to contemplate as far as implying self-ownership. Exodus 21:16. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. See, this is the idea that self-ownership is given to us by God. This is why slavery is a sin, plain and simple. It's stealing another person from themselves. And this is why the originators and great thinkers of our libertarian principles like John Locke, Frederick Bastiat, and Adam Smith grounded their understanding of life, liberty, and property in God. So, all that to say, this is why we are not dethroning God and his sovereignty to accept the concept of self-ownership. We don't flinch when we say that we own property or we're the king of our castle or anything like that. We are only referring to our owning of items within the horizontal relationship. Okay, that got a little bit deep, right? We hit on modern philosophy and theology. But shifting gears a bit, someone that I absolutely love is Mr. Rogers. I know. I'm going to get comments about statism because of his PBS participation, but I don't care. His heart for children and minorities is seldom matched. Anyways, this is from an episode he did about kids and who owns them. And it's a good illustration of self-ownership and the question soon to follow, if we own ourselves and others can't own us, then who owns our kids? The episode is from Season 4 of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It's called A Star for Kitty. It's an opera, and the cast takes roles as different characters to tell a story of a kitty who's celebrating her birthday, and she wants to own a star. The moon comes to life and promises to get her the star, which is named Tiny Star. Well, when the moon goes to get Tiny Star, he can't find him, and Tiny Star ends up hiding from Kitty because he doesn't want to leave the sky, because it's his home. And the moon didn't have the right to take Tiny Star away from his home. So Mr. Rogers sums it all up at the end with a lesson in caring for other people and children's self-ownership.
It's fun to think about stars in the sky, waving, and half moons, and feelings, and singing about all sorts of things. It was hard for Kitty to understand the stars, and it's hard for us too. But what's important is you can pretend about things and dream about things that you don't completely understand. When Kitty started to care about what Tiny Star was feeling, that's when she started to twinkle. And then she realized that nobody could own a star, just like nobody can own anybody else. Nobody owns you, and nobody owns me. But people can care about us just the way we are.
Now this also touches on who owns your kids. Do parents? I'd have to agree with Mr. Rogers here, and all the things we've laid out, that parents do not own their kids. I know this goes against our initial feelings. I know it did mine when I started digging into this term and its understanding. See, there isn't an age that we begin to own ourselves. If this were so, abortion would be acceptable because ownership implies property, and property owners have the right to destroy or abuse their property. Yet, we in no way have the right to abuse or destroy our children. So how do we understand this? It comes down to the biblical principles of loving your neighbor, which is also your family, not just the person that lives in the house next to yours, and its familial responsibilities. Colossians 3:2. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. In Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. I know I may be close to losing some of you. You're probably asking, how does this work? I won't let my kids just be taken away because I don't own them. Yeah, I know. That's the way property typically works, right? But there is a charge that cannot be broken by the parent, the child, nor a third party, including the state. If it is the parent's job to raise the child in the way they should go, and someone prevents that, they are violating the role laid out by God. And that is the violation, not that they took your property. So yes, you can still keep your kids, even if we don't call them your property. They own themselves, just like you own yourself. As with so many things in our faith, It's our charge, our command, and that makes it even more important than property. That makes that vertical relationship even more important than the horizontal relationship. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ said, if someone takes your property, give them more. Let's look at Matthew 5:40 through 41. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. These verses show property of your clothes and self-ownership. As Christians, we are called to endure hardships and patience and forgiveness, and that is seen here. But it doesn't make it not theft of our property. So if someone takes from you, give them more. When someone takes your tunic, give them your cloak too. Someone forcing you to go somewhere is essentially slavery, and this is violating your self-ownership. But when it comes to our babies, we are to protect them with all we have, as that would be the fulfillment of the second greatest commandment to your children. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. All right. I hope you like that explanation of self-ownership and how it applies to many different categories, especially this idea of how it applies to Christian anarchism and Christians. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have no idea? Because this is the first time you've heard of any of this. Let me know on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'm interested in what you think about self-ownership and some of these different perspectives I have presented in this episode. What do you think about the horizontal and vertical relationship? What do you think about self-ownership? What do you think about owning your children or not owning your children or your children owning themselves? So I'll have a link to these quotes and some of the writings that I mentioned in the show notes if you'd like to spend a little bit more time reviewing them. Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcast you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook and the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon. Visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page where you'll find a few ways that you can support us. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.
God said there's a season for every single thing.
Nobody owns you, and nobody owns me.